When it comes to the next generation consoles, there's still an awful lot of mysteries concerning the specifications of the final consoles. Both the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X have a lot of debate concerning the T-flop performance of the consoles, but there are a number of subtle nuances which are just as important for the final performance of the machines. My name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, I aim to settle a couple of mysteries that have been floating around for both Sony and Microsoft's respective consoles. Now bear in mind, neither Sony or Microsoft have revealed final details of their console as of the time that I'm recording this video. This means that an hour or two after I put this video up, there is a possibility that Mark Cerny could kick me in one shin by revealing the specifications of the PlayStation 5, and then Phil Spencer could kick me in the other shin by doing the same for the Xbox Series X. I also want to start with the PlayStation 5 first, because quite frankly it's the simplest of the two mysteries to solve, and also it comes first alphabetically between PlayStation and Xbox. And with the PlayStation 5, the subject I would like to discuss is variable rate shading. For this video, I want to keep things as simple as possible, so I'm not going to go super detailed of what variable rate shading is. However, I've recently conducted an interview with Neil Trevitt, who is the head honcho over at the Kronos Group and also works at Nvidia, and I've also had a second interview with Noble over at Nvidia as well, where I do go at length into variable rate shading. I'll try to remember to link them in the video description, but you can also just search for variable rate shading on the channel, or just do some googling yourself on the internet for more details, but I will go over the basics of what it does. But one frequent negative I hear about the PlayStation 5 is it lacks the ability to perform variable rate shading, whereas the Xbox Series X features the ability to run variable rate shading. So what exactly is variable rate shading? Well, in a nutshell, it's a technique which allows a more efficient rendering of a scene.
Let's keep things simple. Imagine you're looking on a street scene, surrounded by cars, buildings, lamps, and other stuff that you'd associate with a typical street in any city. But let's assume there's two models of the very same car. To keep things simple, we'll suppose that you're looking at these two cars from roughly the same perspective, but car A is quite close and car B is further away. They're both the same car, but for nice easy numbers, let's say that they're drawn in 100,000 polygons. But suppose the car A being closer, perhaps blue, and the red car being further away. But they're both made out of 100,000 polygons. But the red car's further away, isn't it? Just like in real world, objects which are closer you can see in more detail. So I ask you, what's the better idea? To render this car, the further away one, with fewer polygons, let's say 50,000, 30,000, or however many is required based upon your position and of course distance, to approximate the detail based upon your viewpoint. In a nutshell, the purpose behind VRS, variable rate shading, is to funnel the limited resources of a system to draw things which make sense. There's lots of this subject that I'm skipping over, but I believe that this gets us onto the same page. One early report was that Sony is lacking variable rate shading. Leaks we've seen from the Oberon and Ariel testing, the internal testing documents, did state that it wasn't supported, and the fact that the PlayStation 5 uses Nave 10 Lite, people therefore think that PS5 equal no VRS. But I'm here to tell you that this is very unlikely. Last year, I did cover a couple of patents I've discovered for foveated rendering, which is generally used in VR. Essentially, it tracks the fovea of your eyes to know what details you're actually able to make out best, and details in your peripheral vision are rendered with lower detail. We've also seen several other patents from Sony eerily similar to VRS. And don't forget that AMD themselves have VRS patents. It's highly unlikely that a technique like VRS would not be present on the PlayStation 5, particularly how important it would be in the face of virtual reality. No matter how powerful the GPU, no matter how much RAM, CPU performance or anything else, if you're wasting a % of work per frame, it's not exactly the best way to function.
Think of it this way. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there was much talk of techniques such as hidden surface removal and color compression and data compression for the GPUs that were the most powerful right then. But does that mean that the GPUs of, let's say, 2002 were less powerful than the GPUs released in 2000? No, of course not. But still, being able to compress data and not render things which were going to be obscured from view, it just made sense, right? So obviously, it's not just about building a powerful processor, but it's just as important to be as smart about what you're rendering and what details you're rendering certain objects with. With the emails I've been receiving from the individual who claims to have information for the PlayStation 5, I've tackled this extensively in a couple of exclusive videos, so I'll try to remember to link those in the video description. It says that ray tracing and variable rate shading were present on the PlayStation 5's GPU. They were simply disabled with the internal tests. Now, he didn't detail why they were disabled in the internal tests. And also, if you want to believe that information or disbelieve that information, I'll leave down to you. However, if I had to speculate on why variable rate shading and ray tracing were disabled with the tests, well, it could be a multitude of different reasons. One is that there were bugs in the silicon. Don't forget, since then, we've seen multiple revisions of Oberon as well as Ariel. As a quick reminder, Oberon is the APU, Ariel is the GPU for the PlayStation 5, and from what I understand, from what he told me anyway, one of the bug fixes was for the PlayStation 4 backwards compatibility. It apparently was having issues before, so maybe that's one of the other things. Maybe ray tracing or variable rate shading just wasn't working correctly. Maybe they were testing something else entirely, and they didn't want variable rate shading to be an issue with the performance. Maybe they were trying to get raw numbers. It could be a lot of different reasons, but honestly, my personal gut feeling is that Microsoft will have variable rate shading, because of course we've seen so many details that it will have variable rate shading, but given VRS is so critically important for the next generation consoles and their performance, given we've seen all of these patents from Sony, and also given that Sony would have known what AMD are internally doing with their GPU roadmap, I would absolutely be shocked if variable rate shading was not present on the PlayStation 5's GPU. Okay, so I mentioned there's two mysteries. There's been one for the PlayStation 5, so what about the Xbox? Well, the mystery surrounding the Xbox Series X is quite frankly a little bit harder to nail down, but it concerns the memory bandwidth and memory configurations of the console. So essentially, what we understand of the Xbox Series X is it has more memory bandwidth than the PlayStation 5, and one of the reasons behind that, of course, is it allegedly, if the specifications turn out to be true, it has a faster GPU. And one of the things that eats up most bandwidth on a console is the GPU. If you look at the breakdown of memory bandwidth consumed by the CPU of the PlayStation 4, for example, versus the GPU, you can see that it's not even close. However, I will of course point out that the Jaguar processors in both the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 are pretty anemic, but still, this kind of extends to Zen 2 as well, to be honest. A CPU just does not require the memory bandwidth of a modern-day GPU. So, with that said, we've been seeing multiple reports of 560GB per second all the way up to the low 600GB per second of memory bandwidth. But the problem with these figures is it seems to fly in the face of the memory configurations that several websites have been reporting for the Xbox Series X.
So before we get further into this rumour, let's ascertain how bandwidth figures are calculated for RAM. We'll keep things simple. You take the width of the system bus and times it by the GTS, or megahertz, I guess you could also say, of the memory, then divide by 8. So, let's pick on the PlayStation 4 for a moment. It has a bandwidth of 176GB per second. So, what we do here is take 256, which is the width for the PlayStation 4's bus, and multiply that by 5500, which is the speed of the GDDR5 memory inside the console. Then, we divide this by 8, and lo and behold, 176 gigabytes per second, which is the PS4's memory bandwidth. Great. Now we understand that, what mystery is left with the Xbox? Well, Windows Central paints the system of having 16 gigabytes of memories. 3 gigabytes of this is allocated to the OS, with the other 13 gigabytes, of course, being available for games. But internal testing documents clearly point to the Xbox having 560 gigabytes, and honestly, other docs have shown even more than this. So let's take a look at this figure for a moment. If we take a 256-bit bus and multiply by 18,000, this would achieve 576 gigabytes per second for the Xbox. But that RAM would be, well, prohibitively uncommon at this point. According to Dylan522p, he's well known actually in the industry for analysing cost and product availability. Really cool chap, I'll link to his Twitter in the description of this video. He doesn't believe that GDDR6 memory would be financially make sense in terms of mass availability or cost for Microsoft. And honestly, his, well, analysis isn't too far wrong. Look at what we have available right now on the market, and it would point to Sony and Microsoft wanting to be more conservative with the RAM. After all, they need to make sure that they can procure it in abundance. Another wrinkle as well is that the infamous E3 render from Microsoft seems to hint that the console doesn't have a 256-bit bus, but instead 320. I will grant you though, the problem with these renders is they're not exactly designed to be super duper clear, and we can't really get a complete snapshot of the motherboard of the Xbox Series X, or back then of course it was known purely as Project Scarlet. Indeed, there's heavy depth of camera use and just angles to pretty much obscure things. But here, if we take a 320-bit bus, we can take 14,000 times 320 divided by 8, and that fits rather nicely into 560 gigabytes per second, which is perfect within the internal Arden testing. This would mean though that the machine has 20 gigabytes of RAM, and also a wider bus would mean a more complicated PCB. Then again, having more RAM available might be a choice Microsoft decides to make. And there's apparently still 4 gigabytes of DDR4 memory on the Xbox Series X, but I can't verify this myself, and apparently it's for the SSD and not for the OS, but once again, conflicting information, and honestly, not enough information for me to be certain either way. It's also worth noting that if we are going to bring the E3 thing into the equation, the memory configuration was mixed. There was some RAM that looked slower. So it's possible that some of this RAM was for the OS, which would be unlikely given they're throwing DDR4 in there, or we're looking at a split memory configuration, some for the CPU, some for the GPU, which once again would be extremely unlikely. I believe instead that if we are looking at a 320-bit bus and these renders were accurate, which I'm not saying they are, honestly I don't know, most likely the split memory was simply to throw people off for leaks. Ultimately though, one thing we can agree on is that the Xbox Series X has a slower SSD than the PlayStation 5. So perhaps Sony is aiming to use the SSD more to swap data to and from the system, whereas Microsoft instead chose to go with a slower SSD, but instead throw more RAM to the equation. This is speculation, and honestly I'll leave it to go deeper into another time, as I largely say this in ignorance right now, because for one, we don't even know if the slower SSD thing is really true, although for most leaks so far it looks like it is, with Sony having up to twice the speed with the SSD compared to the Xbox, or we don't even know the memory configuration of either console for certain.
I was also told by a couple of people now that Microsoft are cranking up the clock frequencies both of the GPU and memory for the Xbox Series X as the development kits become closer to final revisions. There's also the fact that the PlayStation 5 allegedly doesn't have its memory configuration 100% now down yet. You might recall that someone who was speaking to me, once again, the same chap who had been emailing me, apparently Sony hadn't nailed down the memory configuration yet because there was internal debate of the clock frequency for the DRAM. Basically, the faster the chips obviously are more expensive, and apparently Sony of Japan and Sony of America are kind of internally debating what frequency to go with. But getting back to the Microsoft equation, do I believe that Microsoft may crank up the GPU and memory configuration? Well, if they crank the memory, I was told it could be the low 600 gigabytes per second. As for the GPU, apparently 12 T-flops is almost a lock, and it could go up to 13, which would be around a 7%-ish increase in clock frequency. That's what a couple of people have told me now. I honestly don't know if I believe it, though, because quite frankly, with 56 compute units, which is the number that we seem to be expecting for the Xbox Series X, to see that clock frequency increase to, let's say, 1800 megahertz, that would be a pretty tall order. Now, if this was a discrete GPU for your PC, okay, I can get behind that. But when it's a APU for a console which you assume would have a fairly modest power budget, I'm less receptive to the idea. Does that mean that they won't do it? Well, one of the problems we have when talking about clock frequency, and the same thing could be said for the PlayStation 5, because a number of people are very skeptical of the 2 gigahertz number for the Sony's PlayStation 5, is that we don't know what inherent differences there are in terms of efficiency, in terms of how, for example, power consumption for the GPU. We don't know how higher clocks scale in terms of heat output, and so on and so on. There is so much stuff, and I'm simplifying things, of course, here. We don't know about the next generation console's GPUs. It's very difficult to know what the limitations are. If we compare it to, let's say, the RX 5700 or 5700 XT, then yes, 2 GHz is a pretty damn high clock frequency. But one of my internal sources from AMD tells me that the next generation of RDNA is much more efficient when it comes to higher clock frequencies. However, I don't know whether that actually is true, to be honest. And a report saying that it is true is not the same thing of actually seeing the power figures yourself and seeing how temperatures scale. The other thing that's a really obvious thing is we don't know what the internal cooling solutions are for both consoles. Phil Spencer seems to be indicating that the Xbox is really pushing towards quietness. He said that it's around as quiet as the Xbox One X, which is a very quiet system. And we know that Sony are pushing towards an elaborate cooling solution. And I say we know, this is based, of course, on the Bloomberg report, where the console is allegedly spending more on a cooling solution than what would be traditionally thought of. Then again, we also don't know what Microsoft are doing for its cooling solution. So, what's my thought? I don't know if we're going to see a high clock frequency for the Xbox. I'm saying I wouldn't be surprised, but I would also not be surprised if it's around the 1700-ish megahertz mark. As for Sony and the PlayStation 5, 2 gigahertz, I don't know, honestly. It's certainly possible, but I say that without knowing the full architecture. But anyway, I think that's a good place to call the video. There are still an awful lot of mysteries, of course, for both next-generation consoles, and we'll be attempting to answer them. And of course, as official stuff is confirmed by both companies, we will also be delving very deeply into what that means. I'd also encourage you to check out a recent interview I conducted with a company called AdShare. It's a very interesting software solution for ray tracing that this company is putting forth. And the CEO who I was speaking with, Reuven, he claims that the software implementation of ray tracing technology is a pretty close approximation to what Nvidia are doing with RTX. But he also hinted that it could be used to run ray tracing on the current generation consoles, which has an awful lot of possibilities and also gives me a couple of ideas for future videos as well. Over the next several days, I'm also working to finally put out an RTX video. That kind of got delayed a little bit just because of a couple of other projects, but I'm really happy with the results thus far. So that will be up soon as well. Basically, what I'm telling you all is bloody well subscribe to the channel. But yeah, I think that just about does it for this particular video. Hopefully you found it informative, enjoyable, or something or another. And if you did, then of course leave a like on the video and subscribe. You can also find us on social media in the video description, as well as Patreon. If you feel that you want to donate, that would be highly appreciated and helps us purchase equipment, like we've recently bought a 3700X, and it bought us the RTX 2080 Ti, and so on and so on. So all of your contributions do help there. Furthermore, you can also find Amazon affiliate links, so if you need to buy something from Amazon and use one of those affiliate links, it does much the same thing. It helps support the channel, and of course it doesn't cost you anything more. But with all of that said and all of my self-plugging, I'm going to let you all go. Thank you very much for watching the video and all of your support. Take care of yourself, have an amazing day. Bye for now.